Good afternoon and welcome to today's Nonprofit Net Zoominar on Harness the Power of Data to Tell an Impactful Story. I'm Dora Wong, one of the Nonprofit Net board members. We'll get to our presentation in just a moment. We appreciate your comments on today's program because it helps us plan for future programs, and it's important feedback for our speakers. Specifically, what would you like to see in the future? And another way that you can help us is that to keep our Zoominars open and free to everyone without charge, we need your financial support. So we hope you'll consider supporting us with a suggested donation of $10 to $20. I'll be posting a link on our chat where you can donate to Nonprofit Net. Today, we're delighted to have as our presenter, Joy Mosenfelder.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the presentation on data storytelling. And we're going to be covering some basics. But before we begin, you'll notice I've got a few instructions on the title slide. I'd like you to introduce yourselves, and then if you want, please answer the 3 short questions. Since we have such a large group, we're not doing a traditional icebreaker, but I wanted to give people a chance to kind of do an in-chat icebreaker, and it also gives me a chance to kind of get to know a little bit about what the different goals each of you are. I'll have a Q&A at the end. I did have the questions that were sent in advance from Dora. So we'll start with those and then take questions from the group as time allows. Give it just a couple of more minutes for people to trickle in. All right. Couple more minutes. I'm reading chat while we wait. All right, I think we're ready to begin. So Dora, can you advance to the next slide, please? So welcome to Harness the Power of Data to Tell an Impactful Story. I am Joy Mosenfelder. I'm a communications consultant. I started as a communications manager in 2015 at Victory Programs in Roxbury. And then in 2019, right before the pandemic, I took a role as senior communications manager at Casa Esperanza and finished my time there as the director of communications with a small team under me. So that's 8 years of communications experience and more than 10 years of working in nonprofits. Before I went into communications, I was a program coordinator and did community outreach. And I am one of those rare birds who loves both data and creativity, the strategic and the story side of things. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to kind of give a general overview that's hopefully really useful for everyone, no matter if you're a small organization that's maybe got 1 or 2 staff members or even volunteer-led, to a larger organization. At the end of the presentation, I've also included some links to other resources that could be useful if you want to get more into the details on this. But for the right now, we're going to do a general. If you can go ahead to the next slide, please. We're going to cover the definition of data storytelling, what it is and what it isn't, introduce kind of the benefits, explain key elements of an effective data story, outline the basic steps that I go through to create a data story. Other people may have other ways. You have to find what works for you, and then share resources for future learning. A couple of just general, because terminology can change depending on your role, I just want to give a quick definition of a few words that I'll be using. So I'm going to be using goals, strategies, objectives, and tactics the way that the Nonprofit Marketing Guide by Kiwi LaRoe uses them. So goals are your big picture strategic things. Strategies are sort of the structure of your campaigns or your communications plan. Objectives are what you would think of as SMART goals. So these are the more specific outcomes that you're looking for versus the big picture stuff. And then tactics, which is what data storytelling falls into, are how you implement your strategy. So when I use those words, hopefully we're all on the same page. Next slide, please. So data storytelling is a term that kind of started in the data analytics field. And there are a number of different definitions for data storytelling out there. I've included a few of the ones that I think are most useful on this slide. And I'm on my phone, so I can't read them. Microsoft has kind of the best known definition. The data storytelling is the concept of building compelling narrative based on complex data and analytics that help tell your story and influence and inform a particular audience. Pretty good high-level definition. The other one that I want to call out here is the one from Brent Dykes, who writes for Forbes and published a book on data storytelling called Effective Data Storytelling. Data storytelling is a structured approach for communicating data insights, and it involves a combination of 3 key elements: data, visuals, and narratives. The other definitions here are all pretty good too. If you go online and Google data storytelling, you'll find dozens upon dozens of them. But the common ground is that you're combining data, visuals, and a narrative structure. So the next slide, we're going to break down what those are. So data is your facts and figures, anything concrete. Now, we usually think of numbers when we think of data, but it doesn't necessarily have to always be numbers. In addition to numbers, we can be dates and times. We can be talking about your budget. We can talk about change over time, locations, frequencies, comparisons between A and B, and different categories, materials. Even words can be data. Testimonials are data. Focus group results are data. So we're talking both qualitative and quantitative data here, but it's the material, concrete things that you can really define well. Visuals, again, is images on a page or screen. Now, anytime you're using images in a digital format, you should also consider the needs of people who have visual impairments and may need screen readers. So I do advise, if you're putting an infographic or any other kind of complex image that has information on it, think about how you're going to communicate that in a way that people who can't see it will also be able to get the benefit of it. side topic for another webinar. But there's resources out there on that. But so images is going to include everything from photographs, artwork, and video to infographics, charts, tables, and ways of displaying data, as well as the layout, design, and structural elements that can help add organization to your data. Narrative is what ties everything else together and what differentiates data storytelling from just regular infographics, data visualizations, or other charts and figures. So when neuroscientists have looked at how we make decisions, what they found is that emotion is far more important to our brains than logic, and numbers by themselves are very difficult to remember, but when you put those numbers in a story, it becomes both more easier for people to understand what they mean and easier for them to connect with them emotionally and make informed decisions about them. And there's a lot of overlap between traditional storytelling and data storytelling. It's just kind of the details that are different. So your story is going to still have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Your introduction is, for those of you who've written grant proposals, that's kind of your context. You're describing the problem and the situation on the ground. And then what would in a creative writing or literary story be your rising action, that's your needs statement. That's where you're talking about why this is a problem and what the consequences of leaving things as they are would be. That's going to build up to your climax or your key insight, the aha moment of, we need to do something about this. We need to create change, followed by your call to action. So this is where in, traditional storytelling, literary storytelling, the denouement can kind of be vague. In a data story, you want to be very specific. Tell people exactly what you're asking them to do, and then provide them with next steps, the concrete actions they can take to help do something about the problem that you're trying to solve. I recommend keeping those steps limited. Give people 1 to 3 things to do. The more different options you give people, the less likely they are to follow through on any one of them. So the most effective is a ask that has one very clear action to take, and then every alternative that you give people beyond that gives them an opportunity to kind of go off on a tangent and lose track of it and lose motivation and not necessarily follow through. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, with data storytelling, we're combining data and stories to create something that is more effective than either one is by themselves. Statistics are very cold and impersonal. They're difficult to relate to. And when you hear numbers, you don't necessarily feel what they mean. So if I tell you that in the first 2 weeks after somebody exits incarceration, there is a 12-fold increase in all-cause mortality, that's not necessarily going, it's an interesting fact, but it's not necessarily going to have the same impact as if I say, right after somebody is released from incarceration, the chances of them dying of cancer or heart attack or suicide, overdose, homicide are drastically increased. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they come out of a very controlled, structured environment into a world that they haven't been in for a while. They don't no longer have the skills to navigate that. And oftentimes they're losing support. So they may lose, people in incarceration often don't have insurance. So they may lose their access to their medications or other treatments that they had been on. And so we see this huge spike and it devastates families. The impact of those two things is different, but with the story, if I just tell you the story of one person coming out of prison, you don't necessarily understand the scope of the problem. If I tell you the figures without the story, it lacks the emotional impact. So when you put those two things together, the data gives the story credibility, and the story part is what motivates people to take action due to the empathy that they feel towards the story that you've given them. Other advantages include when you share information in a story format, it's easier for people to remember. A data story with the visualizations makes complex concepts easier to understand, and key insights are clearer and more meaningful, and that emotional response is what really motivates people. And then I've included an infographic here from a study that was done on how people's brains work, and you can see data alone only activates 2 portions of the brain versus storytelling, which lights up the brain all over the place, appeals to both the emotional part of the brain and the logical part of the brain. Next slide, please. So let's talk about using data to tell your story. Before we dive too deep into this section, I want to say the amount of effort that you put into telling a data story should scale to your capacity and available resources. So when I'm walking through this, if you're a small organization or you're volunteer-led, this might look like notes on the back of a piece of paper, scrap paper or napkin, scrawled during a working lunch or something like that. Versus if you're a larger organization and you have an in-house marketing and communications team, or you have outside consultants who can help you with this, you might be doing something more rigorous, like focus groups, on-the-ground studies. It might take you several months to plan a major campaign around a data story versus something that's more back of the envelope, working with the resources that you have. So I know we've got some questions from small organizations and big organizations that had already come in, and we'll talk about that more in the Q&A. So next slide. So the first thing that you want to do is start with your goals and objectives. Goals, again, should be related to your strategic plan and any piece of content you're putting out there. Data, whether it's a data story or a video or a social media post, should tie to your strategic goals. Everything you do, because you're putting staff time and resources into that. So it is a cost to your organization to create content. So you always want that content to serve a purpose. So examples of goals that you might want to use data stories with range from recruiting community partners, to improving your reputation, to expanding access for people with disabilities. And then objectives that might match up with those goals could include having a partner newsletter that goes out once a week, or sharing quarterly program outcomes with your funders to help bolster your reputation, or building an employee intranet and resource hub, which might have explainers and infographics and other tools for staff to use. So data stories can be used both internally and externally. And you want kind of that big picture, what am I trying to accomplish, as well as the more detailed, what is the measurable outcome that I'm looking for from this project. Next slide, please. Once you know what your goals are, you need to determine who you're going to talk to. Who is your partner with this? So for internal audiences, you might be talking to your staff, board members, or volunteers. External audiences would include donors, policymakers, reporters, and participants. And you're going to have different strategies, different approaches, and different kinds of storytelling that will appeal to each group. So once you know who you're talking to, you want to decide what they need to know so that they'll be motivated to help you. So you start with, what do you know about them? Demographics, their characteristics, and what motivates them. So say I'm running a community health center and I want to communicate with other community service providers about establishing a warm referral process. So that would be business to business partner marketing. I want to look at who there is sending out the referrals. So that might not necessarily be leadership at those organizations. It could be direct service staff. And then I look at who's employed in those positions. I could pull that data from the state of Massachusetts or from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics to get an idea of the general age range, the racial and ethnic breakdown of people in those roles, gender, other things like that. And I can finesse that to start looking at, okay, what are people of this age with these educational credentials doing with their spare time? If I'm looking at 21 to 35-year-old clinicians in Boston, they're probably mostly female. They may be into hiking, they may be into cooking, they may be have very active volunteer lives outside of Boston. They're probably in their field because they care about people and they're going to be motivated by a desire to help. And so the case I might make to them is referring clients to our organization gets them a better level of care and gives them a better chance of stabilizing from crisis than they would in another kind of treatment setting. And then here are just a few ideas of where to look for more information. So what I just described in marketing, we call that a persona. It's you create a fictional entity who looks and sounds like and is interested in the things that your core demographic that you're communicating with looks like. And that tells you kind of what emotional angle to take with them and how best to communicate with them, which is what we're going to talk about next slide. Next slide.
Want the next one after this?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go back. Determining how to share your story. So again, if I'm talking to clinicians in Boston, what I may determine is that they're not at their computers very often, but they always have their cell phones on them. So I might not want to do email or website or search marketing. I might want to do a flyers and brochures or a text message campaign instead, or even face-to-face meetings. Maybe I have outreach staff go and meet with partner organizations and give presentations. If I'm talking to board candidates, those are probably executive level people who are in an office at their computers more. Email, web search, landing pages or push marketing might be a more appropriate approach there, or even print mail, maybe sending. And for fundraisers, this is where you're going to see a larger return on investment as well, in sending out a direct appeal to funders, or a print annual report in the mail or newsletters. So now that you know who you're talking to and have kind of an understanding of their habits, you're going to decide which of those communications methods is most effective for reaching them. And then think about, okay, what is the target demographic I'm talking to? What would keep them from A, accessing the information in my data story, reading it, seeing it, hearing it, and B, what other barriers might there be? So this becomes really important both with constituents, for those of you who are in human services and serving vulnerable populations, but also for some of our staff at the lower levels, because they may be facing some of the same challenges that our constituents are facing. So again, accessibility and inclusion is a whole other webinar on its own, but you want to think about, okay, alt text for people with visual impairments. If you're putting video up, closed captioning, or having a sign language interpreter for people who might be hard of hearing. Using plain language if you're talking to a general audience, because you don't necessarily know the literacy level of everybody out there, and plain language is a really powerful way to communicate complex topics in a way that's understandable to everybody without losing any accuracy or information. And what are the best practices around multiple communications for people who might have cognitive differences as well. And then thinking about systemic issues. If you're trying to talk to constituents from a vulnerable population, do they have internet access? If they have internet access, do they have the computer skills to access the story the way that you're sending it, or to interpret an infographic or other more complex content? And so tailoring your approach to meet the needs. Does your population need bilingual content? Does your staff have the capacity to do bilingual content in a culturally competent way, where people who speak another language are getting the exact same information as the people who are who understand the primary language that you're working in? What about people with low literacy or reading comprehension? Education access and attainment is uneven across demographics. So you may need multiple versions of your data story if you're talking to different audiences, to make sure that you're presenting information in a way that's accessible to everybody. So where one group might be getting more complex infographic, another group might get a sort of very simply worded, step-by-step, clear story with less of the facts and figures and jargony stuff in it, and more focus on the story part of it. Next slide, please. And then you're going to want to develop your message. So this is where you really want to focus on. This is where you're starting to get into the structure of the data story that you want to produce. First question you should be asking yourself, because attention spans are limited, and often people will only absorb a few things from any given webinar. For example, this one, my takeaway here that I'd like all of you to walk away with is that data storytelling is a very effective tool for reaching people in a way that is memorable and motivating. And if you have the capacity to add that to your communications toolkit, you might want to consider it for strategic goals where you have the data to back up the story that you want to tell people. So if there's only one thing that people remember about your story, what do you want it to be, is a key piece of information here. With the example I mentioned about people in incarceration, this was a policy paper that I put together that included a data story. The one thing that we wanted policymakers to take away from that is that connecting people pre-release to community services so that they can have a bridge between being in incarceration and being out in the community, and transition support to help keep them connected to services and preserve their continuity of care, is crucially important. And so providers who are working with formerly incarcerated people need reliable access to patients who are pre-release, preparing for release, so that they can start connecting them to services. And then what do you want people to do with the information you include in your story? In that policy paper, what we were asking policymakers to do is to help providers of post-release services get buy-in from the people who work in the incarceration institutions to facilitate that connection with people who are preparing to exit incarceration. We needed allies to help us work together more effectively with those people. And then what's the call to action? So join, donate, call, volunteer, enroll, attend, vote are all active call to actions. That's asking people to go and do something, to respond to an appeal, to volunteer at an event, to enroll in a program, to get out and vote during the election. Passive would be more of your community education plans. So learn more about vaccination and why it's important. If you're addressing stigma, here's how we separate fact from fiction. I've spent a lot of time with organizations that treat substance use disorders. So helping people understand that substance use disorders are not a lifestyle choice, but a medical condition that is largely driven by poverty and desperation. Debunking stereotypes, so addressing things like racism, nationalism, disability discrimination, and talking about how the perception of certain groups of people doesn't match the reality. People with disabilities, we often think about them as being less capable all around, but really just because somebody has a disability, a chronic illness, or an impairment doesn't mean that they're not just as capable as somebody without that impairment in the areas of their life that disability does. So somebody with a mobility disorder can be just as capable of holding a high-level complex job as somebody without a mobility disorder, or vice versa. So really, like, getting to the heart of people are people, and everybody has strengths and weaknesses. So those are more passive goals. So changes in perception versus changes in behavior, which would be those active goals. Next slide, please. So now you want to select your data. We're not even at the narrative yet. That'll come after the data. So your data is going to shape your narrative. And some of you will probably have really robust and lots of internal data about your budget, your program inputs, your program outcomes, your staff demographics, your history in the community, and various things that you can pull from. That's great. And that can be useful for talking to both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So if you're talking to funders, you might want to tell a data story about your program outcomes and highlighting your major successes or your timeline of growth. Those are internal things. If you're talking to community partners, you might want to talk about focus groups if you've got high client satisfaction and the results of that, or interview responses. If you're talking to your board of directors and you're advocating for a new team member who's you want to create a new role and hire someone to do something that's not currently happening at the organization, you might want to talk about both the financial advantages of that and the way it'll support capacity at your organization. So you might have job descriptions, employee reviews, or needs assessment. If you're talking to finance about needing to change how the budget is put together, you might want to look at your historic financials and put together kind of a story of other times when you've had a major change in your budget, what that accomplished and what you anticipate it would accomplish going forward with the better data. And then external sources, for those of you who, this is useful, but for both people who do have robust internal data, and especially useful for those of you who don't necessarily have the capacity to collect that data because you're too small or you haven't been around a long time. You can still find data that supports your message through external sources. Almost every government agency, from the state and city-state to federal government, collects data on a number of different things. So Massachusetts has data on the incarceration system. They've got data on the opioid epidemic. They've got data on demographics and employment. U.S. Census Bureau is a great place to find all kinds of demographic data. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has tons of data about employment trends. And you'll find a lot, if you go looking for it, you can find a lot of data that can support your message through those through government sources. Another place to look for data is accredited academic programs and independent research teams that are doing research studies, including polls, surveys, more robust studies looking into specific questions about things like data storytelling. One of the links that I have at the end of this is actually a study that they did on the effectiveness of data storytelling in terms of education and information retention. How different models of treatment for substance use disorders perform compared to each other. How the difference between somebody who doesn't speak English seeing a provider who doesn't speak their language versus with a translator needed versus seeing a provider who does speak their language, and the change in the positive change in outcomes when people are seeing somebody who speaks their language and understands their cultural context. There's tons of research out there, and a lot of it is behind a paywall, but if you email the researchers directly, you can often get those papers without having to pay for them. Especially if it's a researcher who works in kind of a field that doesn't get a lot of attention. They're always really excited to hear that somebody is interested in their work. Another great place is to look for investigative reporting. Verified fact checking results are a good way. And then for independent research teams, that be things like the Pew Research Foundation and other groups that aren't tied to an academic institution, but are still doing robust, non-biased data collection and analysis. And what you don't want to overwhelm your audience, regardless of whether you've got a large enough team that you can do really sophisticated comb through that external data to find what you need, or analysis of your own internal data, or if you're a smaller organization who is kind of doing the back of the envelope thing, you want to limit the data points that you're showing to those that that align with your message best. Too much data and you're going to overwhelm the people that you're talking to and lose them. Too little data and your story won't have the same level of credibility as it should have to really convince and motivate people. So think about maybe 2 to 3 key points for the introduction. You might want to add even 3 to 5 in that statement of need. So that might be industry comps. There aren't any other providers providing services exactly the way that we do. So this is a need in our community because nobody's doing this work. Going back to my own experience with working in bicultural behavioral health, there are only 2 organizations in Massachusetts who've provided full continuum of care in English and Spanish with providers who are fluent at every level of care. So that means the ratio of providers to Spanish speakers is 1 to 300 versus the ratio of providers to English speakers is 1 to about 35. And that means that people who speak Spanish aren't getting the support they need to recover from behavioral health complications. And then when you're getting into that kind of key insight and denouement, again, you kind of want to cherry pick the data and keep it, that part more focused on the story that you're trying to tell, especially, and then get back to the data with the next steps. Those should be concrete and data driven. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, yep. Creating, back, sorry. Back one.
Oh, sorry.
Creating your data story. So now you're ready to put together your narrative structure. You've got your data. You want to outline each section and make notes about the data that's going to go into it. Decide which data to put where. Create your visual elements. If you're talking to executives and high-level policymakers or things like that, you might want your charts, tables, graphs, infographics, flow charts, photos, videos, artwork are going to be more impactful with individual donors, community members, partner organizations. Testimonials will work really well there. And then remember that your layouts are also part of your visual elements. So choose structures and colors that add organization and clarity to your work and emphasize the key points that you want people to focus on, especially that main takeaway that you want people to walk away with. You can repeat that a few different times in each throughout the different sections within your data story so that it really hits home. So that is kind of the links in the resources section will give you a more robust idea of how that process could work for your organization. Again, it's going to look different at smaller organizations than it is at larger organizations. So I didn't want to get too in the weeds on this part. But this is kind of the kind of basic process of getting to where you're getting ready to pull everything together and pull it into a data story. So now we're in the wrap up. And we can get right to the next slide. So the key takeaways: data storytelling combines data, visuals, and narrative structure to communicate insights and motivate action. Data stories are easier to understand, more memorable, and more persuasive than either data or stories alone. Data and narrative structure have complementary strengths that offset each other's weaknesses. And effective data stories should be goal-oriented, easy to follow, and have a very clear message supported by concrete evidence. Next slide. So these are some key resources that I think are very good. What is data storytelling is from that, it's a full article that goes along with that Microsoft definition of data storytelling. Effective data storytelling is the website for Brent Dykes, the author. That's also the title of his book, and he writes about data storytelling for Forbes magazine quite a bit. Storytelling with Data is a project that has several different authors. They've got tons of blog posts about specific strategies for using data to tell a story. It's a very rich resource with lots and lots of detailed information about how different kinds of data and visualizations can be worked into storytelling to make effective storytelling. They've been running for a number of years now. So I think they've got over 100 blog posts up there, and they're all very topic driven. How to tell a great data story is sort of a more detailed introductory article than what we've gone through. It's a more complex version of the presentation you just saw. And then this article from the, I think it was Forbes, is kind of a fun one that talks about sort of the neurology and science behind storytelling. And then this last link is a research paper on comparative storytelling with image data, and the analysis of the methods and tools and the results in terms of memorability and comprehension. Next slide. So now we are at the Q&A, and I'm gonna pull up the questions that were sent in advance here. And if you have questions, feel free to type them into chat. Or we can open the comms and get those questions going as well. But I'm going to start with, for an arts organization that only has data on numbers attending, percentage of financial aid, and how would one go about quantifying our programming? So this is one where I would look at the research, because we have a ton of studies in the humanities about the benefits of making art accessible to the public. Art as therapy, art as a form of empowerment, art as protest, art as communication. Look at your programming and what you're accomplishing in your programming, and then look for the research that supports bringing art to communities that have historically not been able to access more traditional methods of art. So the benefits of bringing art to low-income communities or communities that have been targets of institutional oppression, and use that external data there to support your message if the internal data isn't quite where you want it to be yet. And then think about doing pre and post surveys with the people enrolled in your programs going forward, so that you can start getting, or focus groups, or calling alumni and starting to gather testimonials or things like that, so that you start getting the data that you need going forward to tell your data story. What if you're a startup organization and don't yet have significant impact data? Again, go to the research. There are lots of areas where either startups or small organizations don't have the data that they need. And if you don't know how to do the research yourself, hire someone who has experience researching different topics who can help you find that data. And then what kind of data analysis tools are more effective? How can make storytelling more as appealing during Zoom? How can I use successful content to expand my audience and reach? Those are all big questions. There are a lot of tools out there, and it's going to depend on your resources, capacity, technical literacy, and available time. If you type data storytelling into Google, you are going to find literally dozens of software projects, and which works best is going to depend on what you want to do. In terms of the storytelling, you want to keep it tight. You want to focus on clarity and the human interest side of things. And you want that narrative structure. So you don't want the story to kind of be flat. You want you want to really, really follow the problem, the need statement, the aha moment, and the here's how we fix it and how you can help. And how can I use successful content to expand my audience and reach? Find out what the people that you want to talk to care about. So at one of my previous jobs, we wanted to talk to we wanted to do referral marketing. We wanted to talk to partners about our programs and services so that we would increase our referrals. So we launched a newsletter. In the first section of the newsletter, we actually called News You Can Use, and included links to upcoming webinars, new published resources, community events, training opportunities that were relevant to our target audience, not things that we were doing ourselves, but just any resources in the community that would be of interest. That drove our open rates up significantly. We found that people were clicking on that, but they weren't scrolling down through the rest of the newsletter. So we actually added that at the bottom, one at the top and more articles at the bottom. And then we found that people were reading all the way around once we announced that scroll down for more news you can use. So that's a type of marketing called content marketing. And there's lots of information out there. Nonprofit Marketing Guide has a really good set of blog articles on that, as well as a book called Content Marketing. It's a very effective way of getting your audience to stay loyal, because you're providing them things they find valuable, rather than just ask. So if you can sandwich your ask between valuable stuff that they want, that's going to help grow your audience. You can do that on social media. You can do that in your annual report. You can do that in explainers, how-tos, sharing industry knowledge. It can be internal or external, depending on what you have available to you. Our organization has a meeting in data and results, but we aren't reporting them in a fresh, new, and compelling way. How can we make our strong results work for us? Focus on your narrative structure. If that's the case, you've already got the good numbers, so you want to work on that story. And I would say do some A/B testing if you have the capacity to do that, or ask for feedback from people outside your industry, people who look like the people that you want to talk to, people who aren't familiar with the work that you're doing, to find out if what you're presenting is interesting to them, because it's very interesting. It's very easy to write stories that are interesting to us about our own fields. It's harder to make those stories interesting to people who don't already have the same knowledge that we have. And that's the real challenge around getting your audience engaged, is that they don't necessarily have the same background or emotional resonance with what you think they should, or what you expect them to, because they don't have the same, they're not starting from the same place. And
Joy,
then,
I'm just going to, just because we're getting on a couple of minutes until 1, for if you have time, we'll stay on, but I just want to make sure we acknowledge our 2 o'clock time.
okay.
I just want to thank you so much for a very comprehensive webinar today on data storytelling. For those that are interested for some more questions, Joy looks like she is available, but I just want to give you a reminder that your feedback is very important to us. So please fill out the survey when you log out. And we do depend on your support. So please donate if you can, $10 to $20 to us, and that will help us make sure that our seminars are available free to everyone. And finally, just a plug for our upcoming seminar on December 10th. Gail Snow-Moraski will be presenting on Google nonprofit ad grants. For long-time attendees, I just want to let you know that it is on a Tuesday, but it is at 2 p.m. It's starting at 2 p.m., not 1 p.m. So please make a note of that. And with that, for those of you that will stay on, we'll stay on. But otherwise, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in December.
Dora, can you also download the chat? I'm on my cell phone, so I can't do it myself.
Absolutely.
But if we download,
everything gets downloaded. Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. So if we download the chat, I will also send out an email and follow up with some answers to the other questions that have come in towards the end, and the ones that were sent in advance that we didn't have a chance